Number 12. OSS Stinger Pen Pistol. A hand goes into a shirt pocket, not for a pistol, but for something no bigger than a fountain pen. It's cold, slick, almost weightless. 3.5 inches of metal, half an inch thick, about an ounce in the hand. Outside, boots scrape a street in occupied France. Inside, there may be 1 second to act. 1 arm's length chance before a search, a door burst open, a face recognized. This is the OSS Stinger, a factory-loaded .22 short, hidden in plain sight, built to fire once and be thrown away like trash. Not a battlefield sidearm, a desperation instrument for couriers, saboteurs, and agents dropped behind German lines. Some of the most ruthless little weapons of World War II were built for the ugliest problems. Governments often tried hardest to deny, ban, or bury exactly those tools. June 1944, Central France. Damp night air hangs over a stone lane as a truck rattles past the end of the village. You are in a back room above a shuttered shop. Your shoulder presses into rough plaster. Below, someone moves too carefully. Not the loose, easy noise of a neighbor. Measured steps. A pause on the stair. Then another. On the table beside you lies what the drop brought in pieces over weeks. Coated scraps, ration cards, batteries, a folded silk map, a radio crystal wrapped in cloth. The useful things are all small here, small enough to hide, small enough to lose, small enough to survive the search that catches everyone eventually. Tonight there are 3 men in the room, 1 French, 1 British, 1 American. Jedburgh, the kind of team London and Washington began pushing into occupied Europe as D-Day approached. For beaches and headlines, but for roads, rail lines, bridge charges, dead telephone wires. Between June and September, 276 of them would parachute into the war zone. 83 Americans, 90 Britons, 103 Frenchmen. But numbers disappear fast in a room like this. Here, there are only breaths. 1 candle, 1 stare, 1 wrong knock. The American reaches first. Not for the sten under the blanket, too big, too loud. Not for the pistol in the satchel, too slow if hands are already on you. He goes to his breast pocket and pulls out a cylinder so plain the eye slides off it. It could be a pen. It could be a cigarette holder. In a search, that plainness is the whole design. Back in Washington, this was the sort of thing William Donovan had people designing by the crate. Under Wild Bill, the Office of Strategic Services prepared for a different war. False papers, sabotage kits, little devices built to solve one problem completely. The Stinger fit that world exactly. AT-1E1 Stinger, .22 caliber. Factory loaded, 1 shot, meant to be used up and discarded. Not a sidearm you keep, a sidearm you survive with. The steps stop outside the door. The Frenchman kills the candle with wet fingers. The room goes black at once. Not dim, black. Cloth brushes wood. Somebody below murmurs in German. Another voice answers. The house has been entered. No dramatic crash, no screaming, just the calm, bureaucratic sound of men doing this for the 100th time. In the dark, the Stinger is almost too small to trust. Half an inch thick, barely more than an ounce. Less weapon than mechanism. Its .22 short cartridge is not a soldier's cartridge. No one would choose it for a firefight in a field. This is not a field. This is 2 paces of darkness, and whoever comes through the door first. He curls his fingers around the metal tube and feels for the end. There is no grip to settle into, no sights worth speaking of, no second try built into the design. The whole thing exists for 1 room distance fact. If a man puts a hand on you, you may still have 1 last move he does not see coming. The latch shifts. The British officer eases the blanket off the radio set on the bed. Not to use it, to hide the shape beneath. The Frenchman backs toward the window, though the drop to the alley would break more than silence. The American stands beside the door, close enough that the barrel will not have to point so much as touch. This is where a weapon like this makes sense. Not on a firing range, not in a manual, in the geometry of panic. 3 feet, maybe 2. A door opening inward, a search becoming an arrest becoming a name. Then another name. Then an entire circuit rolled up because one room was entered 2 minutes too soon. The knob turns. He raises the stinger chest high. There is almost nothing to raise. Earlier models had already shown how fragile this idea could be. Tens of thousands had been made in 2 patterns, 25,000 of the first, then 25,500 more through the Ordnance Department in 1944, after problems that included misfires and even burst barrels. So the tiny tube in his hand carries a private doubt along with the cartridge. If he presses and gets a click, the room is finished. If it works, it must work now. The door opens 6 inches. A blade of hall light cuts across the floorboards. First a boot, then a trouser leg. The black outline of a man leaning in with one hand still on the latch. He has not seen the American yet. He is looking for the bed, for the table, for evidence. He expects fear to be larger than this. The American steps in close and jams the metal tube up under the ribs. The shot is not loud in the way a battlefield shot is loud. In a cramped room, it is worse. Small, sharp, intimate. The German folds with a grunt more of surprise than pain, hits the frame and drags the door wider as he drops. Somebody shouts below. The staircase erupts. Now! The British officer rips the radio crystal from the table. The Frenchman is already at the window. Boots hammer upward, fast now, no caution left. The American does not reload because there is no reload. He does exactly what the weapon was built for. He lets it fall. It hits the floor and vanishes among shadows and splintered plaster, just another scrap in a room about to be abandoned. A one-shot pistol disguised as nothing important, fired once and discarded like trash. In 1944, the OSS printed the Stinger in its own special weapons manual, manufactured it by the tens of thousands, and sent men into France who could have needed exactly this kind of last-ditch tool. No surviving record names the agent who actually fired one. Number 11. SOE Sleeve Gun. On February 11, 1944, Major Hugh Reeves was not standing in a back alley with a target in front of him. He was in the paper world that decides which secret weapons live and which quietly die. Somewhere between Station 9 near Welland Garden City and the desks of America's OSS, his strangest design had reached formal testing. The report was simple. A suppressed single-shot weapon in .32 ACP, 7.65 mm, about 22.9 centimeters long, Parkerized steel. Too small to pass for a normal pistol, too specialized to pass for anything else. Reeves had already helped create the Welrod. Here, he stripped even that idea down to the bone. No proper grip, no useful magazine for a fight. Just a short tube built to hide inside a coat sleeve, drop into the hand at arm's length, fire once, and disappear again. It sounds theatrical now, almost fictional. Reeves was not designing props. He was working on the ugliest problem in clandestine war. How do you kill one man at touching distance, in a hallway, on a staircase, at a checkpoint, without carrying a pistol that gives you away before you reach him? Britain had created the Special Operations Executive in 1940 for exactly that kind of war. Occupied Europe, occupied Asia. Sabotage, courier work, assassinations, demolitions, radios, forged papers, quick deaths in the wrong rooms. At the Fryth, Station 9, Reeves and his team turned that mission into hardware. Some of it looked ingenious, some of it looked desperate. The sleeve gun looked like both. The design only makes sense if you follow the body first. Your arm hangs at your side. The device sits hidden under the sleeve, strapped on like a comic book wrist pistol, not spring-loaded into the palm by magic. It is arranged so it can drop or be drawn into the hand at the last instant. Some descriptions suggest a lanyard or elastic return. Fire at contact range. Release it. Let it slip back or let it fall. Either way, the hand comes away almost empty. That was the whole idea. Not firepower, not accuracy, not survival in a prolonged encounter. One act, one intimate mechanical decision. Reeves understood how narrow that made the weapon. Unlike the Welrod, which still resembled a brutally minimalist handgun, the sleeve gun was closer to an assassination component. You carried it for one moment and one moment only. If that moment passed, it became dead weight. If that moment arrived, nothing else that small was better suited to it. The better a weapon fits a forbidden job, the harder people work to deny the job exists. By 1944, that tension was sitting on Reeves's desk. The sleeve gun had crossed the Atlantic for Allied evaluation, but evaluation is not adoption. The OSS tested it on February 11, 1944, and again in January 1945. Twice, they looked at the same cold logic. A hidden tube under the sleeve. One 7.65 round, suppressed. Drawn into the hand only at the instant of use. Twice, they stopped short of embracing it. That says something important. The design was not absurd. If it had been absurd, it would have been dismissed at once. It was plausible. The dimensions read like forensic notes. Length, 230 millimeters. Height, 44. Width, 32. Small enough to hide in clothing, but large enough to snag if the external controls stood proud. Mark II was reshaped with a lower profile layout, specifically to move more cleanly inside the sleeve. No one makes that change for a museum curiosity. You make that change for a tool you think someone may actually carry into a room with another human being. Reeves had built a weapon that exposed its own moral center by refusing to be useful for anything else. A service pistol can be explained away. Self-defense, last resort, battlefield necessity. A suppressed tube with one round, hidden in a sleeve, cannot hide behind those words for long. Even the paperwork seems to recoil. In the 1945 Descriptive Catalog of Special Devices and Supplies, it appeared as item N254. One description called it a short-length, silent murder weapon. Not silent pistol, not emergency arm. Murder weapon. That phrase matters because bureaucracies usually sand the edges off everything. They rename, soften, generalize. Reeves's little gun pushed the other way. Its honesty was almost brutal. It announced its purpose, and that made it harder to defend in public than larger, louder, far deadlier weapons. A bomber can kill hundreds and still be discussed in terms of strategy. This thing was built for one set of ribs in one dim corridor. Follow Reeves to the end of the trail. He invents the device at Station 9, one of Britain's hidden workshops of war. He solves the concealment problem down to the sleeve itself. He gets the weapon into Allied testing. The Americans examine it in 1944. They examine it again in 1945. They do not adopt it. The sleeve gun survives in museum records, in measurements, in catalog listings, in the faintly chilling neatness of archival language. What does not survive is the one thing that would settle everything. A named wartime operation, a documented field issue, a confirmed killing tied to the weapon in use. So Major Hugh Reeves leaves behind one of the purest covert sidearms of the war, and one of the hardest to place inside the war itself. You can hold the dimensions, you can read the tests, you can see the engineering problem and the answer. When you reach for the final proof, the human scene it was built to create, the trail goes cold. That absence fits the weapon too well. It was designed to appear for 1 second and disappear again, and that is what it does in the historical record. It is not obscure because it failed. It is obscure because success would have looked exactly like this. No witness, no scene, no second shot. In the file, it remains item N254. Short length, silent. Murder weapon. Number 10. Sedgley OSS Glove Pistol. On February 29, 1944, U.S. Navy officer Stanley M. Haight filed a patent for something he called a fist gun. Not a pistol drawn from a holster, not a derringer tucked into a sleeve. This weapon was bolted to the back of a work glove. It stayed out of sight until your hand was already on the target. In legend, it became the perfect forbidden sidearm of the Pacific War, a secret assassin's tool, an OSS oddity, a gadget so vicious it feels half rumor. But the record points somewhere stranger. The closer you look, the less it resembles a spy fantasy. It looks more like a desperate Navy answer to hand-to-hand panic. Hate's filing date matters because it comes late. February 1944 is not the early scramble of wartime improvisation. By then, the United States is deep into the Pacific War, and everyone involved already knows how close combat can get. Beachheads, night infiltrations, machinery crews caught exposed, men holding tools instead of rifles. The problem is brutally narrow. What do you give someone who may be grabbed, boarded, rushed, or climbed onto at touching distance, with no time to draw and no room to aim? Sedgley of Philadelphia built the answer. The official Navy name was almost comically bland. Hand Firing Mechanism Mark II. It sounds like office paperwork. The device itself did not. It was a leather glove with a tiny smoothbore barrel fixed across the back of the hand with 6 brass rivets. The barrel was 2 7/8 inches long. One shot. Surviving production examples are commonly cited in .38 S and W, though the patent concept pointed toward a .410 shot shell. Somewhere between patent and production, the caliber changed. No one can say with certainty why. That should cool the legend a little. Real secret weapons usually come out cleaner in the retelling. This one gets muddier. Even the production total shifts depending on the source, roughly 52 at the low end, about 200 at the high end. That is not standard issue. It is also not a one-off joke. Someone designed it, someone ordered it. Sedgley made enough of them that examples still sit in museums and private collections as hard proof that somebody really approved this thing. The firing method is what turns the object from curiosity into something uglier. There was no normal trigger. A plunger projected from the front, and the weapon fired only when the wearer slammed his fist into the target. You were not supposed to point it across a room. You were supposed to touch first. Ribcage, abdomen, maybe the chest at near point-blank range. The design solves one problem by creating one exact scene. The enemy gets close enough to grab, and you do not draw at all. You hit him. One surviving example in the National World War II Museum is linked to an officer from Beach Jumper Unit 7. That matters because the beach jumpers were not ordinary infantry. They handled deception, fake landings, false signals, noise, confusion. Men in small craft near shorelines where boarding was a real possibility. In the story attached to that issued glove pistol, the officer gets a short, cold instruction. If an enemy boat comes alongside, raise your hands as if surrendering, then strike when they come in close. You can see why that story survives. A man in a rocking boat, hands up, another boat sliding alongside in the dark, faces close enough to read. Then the lunge. Sounds almost too perfectly written. Still, the object exists, the unit exists, the issue story exists. What does not exist is a confirmed combat report showing that blow landing. There is another story, rougher and less theatrical. It places a glove pistol with the 31st Naval Construction Regiment, not commandos, Seabees. Builder John Blocker is on a road grader when a knife-armed Japanese soldier climbs onto the machine. In that version, the glove gun stops looking like a spy gadget. It becomes an emergency weapon for a construction man with no room to reach for anything else. If that story is true, the work glove suddenly makes perfect sense. Not costume, not theater, a tool hidden inside a tool. But the record stays dry. Forgotten Weapons, after digging through what survives, found no confirmed combat use. Not for the OSS, not for the CB story, not for the beach jumper issue story. There are named anecdotes, there are unit links, there are physical examples. There is no documented wartime kill tied cleanly to the weapon in use. That gap matters because this object practically begs people to exaggerate it. The name alone helps. People call it the Sedgley OSS glove pistol all the time, and even that title is less solid than it sounds. Sedgley is correct. Glove pistol fits. OSS use, does not have confirmation behind it. The stronger documentary trail runs through the Navy label Hand Firing Mechanism Mark II, not through a clear OSS field record. The popular name sells covert legend. The paperwork points to something more bureaucratic, more naval, and somehow more unsettling. Its legal afterlife is another sign that the thing never fit neatly anywhere. Later American firearms classification, the Haight-Sedgley glove gun appears in BATF material in conflicting ways. In one place, it is treated like a curio and relic item removed from registration requirements. Elsewhere, it appears under categories that would require registration. That does not tell us how often it killed. It does show how badly the object resists normal definitions. Is it a pistol? A disguised gun? A specialty weapon? Even the paperwork wobbles because the design does, so strip it down to what can be proved. Date: February 29, 1944. Inventor: Stanley M. Haight. Manufacturer: Sedgley, Philadelphia. Official name: Hand Firing Mechanism Mark II. Construction: leather work glove, 6 brass rivets, 2 7/8-inch smooth-bore barrel, 1 round, impact-fired plunger. Production: somewhere between 52 and 200. Surviving examples? Yes. Cleanly documented wartime combat use? No. What remains is still hard to shake. This was not built to win a firefight. It was built for the instant after a firefight failed. For the moment war collapsed into hands, weight, breath, and one hidden shot. A man in a small boat lifts both hands in the dark. Another man leans in to search him. The fist drives forward. Number 9. FP-45 Liberator Pistol. On May 15, 1942, in Anderson, Indiana, General Motors Guide Lamp Division received a contract for 1 million handguns. Not rifles, not submachine guns. 1 million pistols, ordered in wartime secrecy for people who were not supposed to be soldiers at all. Around 300 workers were sworn in. The drawings avoided plain language. Parts were labeled with words like tube and yoke, so the line did not read like a line building guns. By August 21st, the million were done. Just over 10 weeks. That works out to an average of 6.6 seconds per pistol. The output sounds like mass industry. The gun itself was brutally simple. Start with the dimensions. 14 centimeters overall, a 10-centimeter barrel, single shot, smooth bore, chambered in .45 ACP, a full-power military pistol cartridge, fired here through the crudest possible launcher. No magazine, no extractor, no feed system, no safety in the modern sense. The FP-45 was built from stamped sheet steel around a die-cast body because longevity was never the point. Volume was. George Hyde worked up the prototype under General Motors' Inland Division. After approval came in early May 1942, the job shifted to Guide Lamp because Guide Lamp knew how to make cheap metal objects fast. Picture the user, because this thing only makes sense at arm's length. You pull back the cocking piece, you rotate it, you drop 1.45 round into the chamber, you close the breech, you fire. Then the empty case stays there because there is no extractor to pull it free. Every boxed pistol came with a wooden rod, 10 rounds, 1 pistol, 1 little stick for punching out the spent case after the shot. Famous line is that it took longer to load than to manufacture. With 6.6 seconds per gun, that is not much of a joke. It is close to an audit. Now the cost. About $2.10 for the pistol plus packaging. The gun itself is often cited at roughly $1.73. At 1942 wartime scale, that was the entire argument. A real sidearm diverted from American or British troops carried a real military opportunity cost. This did not. It was a disposable bridge between an unarmed civilian and somebody else's weapon. Fire once at point-blank range. Take the rifle. Take the submachine gun. Take the actual pistol. That was the theory, not marksmanship, not sustained fighting. Acquisition. Even the name was a disguise. FP did not advertise pistol. It stood for flare projector. In paperwork, that sounded like signaling equipment instead of a one-shot killing tool meant for occupied territory. If you scatter 1,000,000 obvious pistols by air, you announce insurgency. If you ship flare projectors, the paperwork stays quieter. The weapon entered the record already masked by its own label. Open the box, and the rest of the design keeps speaking in numbers. 10 cartridges, 1 dowel. Pictorial instructions, because the intended user might not read English and might never have handled a firearm before. This was not built for trained commandos. The Welrod at least assumed a chosen operator. The FP-45 assumed the opposite, an occupied civilian. Little training, one chance, very close range. Every detail narrows toward that single moment. The smoothbore barrel cuts machining time. The lack of extractor cuts parts. The simple stamped construction cuts cost. Accuracy barely matters if the shot happens from a few feet away into a sentry's chest or back. Then the production scale crashed into deployment policy. Of the 1 million made, 500,000 were shipped to Great Britain for possible resistance use. That sounds enormous until the next number appears. Eisenhower's command considered only about 25,000 acceptable for emergency use. 1 in 20 of the British shipped stock. The rest sat under a strategic veto. The pistol solved one problem and created another. It was cheap. It was concealable. It could arm people without draining standard-issue sidearms from Allied troops. But dropping hundreds of thousands of crude .45 pistols into occupied Europe meant more than distributing weapons. It meant making a political promise that somebody would rise, shoot, and then survive the retaliation. That is where the production story changes direction. In March to May 1942, psychological warfare planners inside the U.S. Army pushed the idea hard. The arithmetic looked irresistible. 1 million pistols in just over 10 weeks, made by 300 workers for about $2 apiece, intended to convert fear into action. Field commanders did not see a spreadsheet. Eisenhower did not want mass drops in Europe. MacArthur was not enthusiastic in the Pacific. Stilwell was not enthusiastic either. The OSS inherited a weapon whose value was partly emotional, partly symbolic, and only conditionally lethal. Even its weakness could be treated as policy. Late 1942 thinking did not view poor durability as only a defect. Tropical humidity might rust the gun away. From one angle, that was embarrassing. From another, useful. A pistol that disappears into corrosion leaves fewer long-term weapons floating around after the war. So the gun was designed to be cheap, perhaps to fail, perhaps even to vanish. That is a strange class of sidearm, one built not for service life, but for a single transfer of force from one body to another and then into history's trash pile. One more number hangs over it: unknown. No reliable total exists for how many FP-45s were actually fired in hostile action. Sources agree some reached China, the Philippines, and Greek resistance forces. Claims of huge drops into France remain unproven. The contract date is firm, May 15, 1942. The completion date is firm, August 21, 1942. The labor force, 300. The output, 1 million. The cost, $2.10 boxed. The ammunition in each package, 10 rounds. The British shipment, 500,000. The emergency use approval, 25,000. But the number that matters most in a normal weapons history, shots fired in anger, slips out of the file. That missing figure suits the weapon. Officially, the FP-45 Liberator was a mass-produced tool to arm resistance cheaply and quickly. It was one of the largest pistol runs of the war, hidden behind the harmless label, flare projector. In practice, it often functioned as something colder, a psychological weapon, built in staggering numbers for a battlefield where commanders chose not to trust the people it was made for. Number 8. Welrod Mark II. If one small British assassination gun really did come back out of the dark and into a Copenhagen living room, the consequences were brutally simple. A weapon designed to help occupied Europe fight back could be captured, stripped of identity, and used to kill civilians so quietly that neighbors might hear almost nothing at all. No battle line, no warning, just a man at his own desk, opening the door at 6:30 in the evening. On December 30th, 1943, in occupied Copenhagen, newspaper editor Christian Dam let 5 men into his home. Their names were Otto Schwert, Louis Nabel, Anton Gefuller, Ludwig Hoof, and Kurt Karstensen. They belonged to the Peter Group, a German-backed terror unit used in Denmark for reprisal attacks and political murder. Later accounts built from Danish Resistance Museum and police material state that 2 of them, Schwert and Nabel, had test-fired their weapons earlier that same day. The pistols were Welrods. That detail matters because the Welrod was not another compact sidearm with a suppressor screwed onto the front. It was built from the start for different work. Designed in Britain for the SOE at Station 9 and manufactured beginning in 1943 by Birmingham Small Arms, the Welrod Mark II in .32 ACP or 7.65 mm was a near-sterile pistol. Few normal markings, little to identify a nation, little to identify a maker. Some surviving examples carry coded symbols, a square, a star, fragments instead of a proper signature. The whole design aimed at deniability in metal. In Denmark, that deniability curdled. Some of these pistols were airdropped for resistance work. That was the plan. Close-range weapon for agents, saboteurs, couriers, for people who might need to shoot 1 sentry, 1 collaborator, 1 target, and vanish. The Mark II carried 5 rounds in the magazine. Its effective range was short, around 10 yards in some museum summaries, maybe 20 or 30 under better conditions and with a steady hand. But that already makes it sound too neat. This was not a pistol for fair distance. It was a pistol for breath distance. Picture the room. Dam's study. Books, papers, indoor lamplight. 5 men in the house, but only 1 instant matters. Nebel draws the Welrod. Dam does not freeze. He grabs the suppressor tube and fights for the muzzle. It sounds almost absurd until you remember the shape of the weapon. Long and narrow, more tube than pistol, a tool built around silence. 3 shots go off. Dam is hit in the back, in the thigh, in the head. He is terribly wounded, but not dead. That failure makes the scene more revealing, not less. The Welrod's reputation can make it sound surgical, as if silence guarantees efficiency. It does not. The Mark II was chambered in .32 ACP, smaller than the later, heavier Mark I in 9 mm. It was meant for very close work and very deliberate work. But this turned into a grappling match in a cramped room. Arms tangled, tubes seized, bodies moving. The distance between execution and survival was the width of a hand on a suppressor. A conventional pistol announces itself. A shot cracks through a street, a hallway, a stairwell. People duck, people run. They know violence has started. The Welrod was built to shrink that moment. One 2002 test on a restored .32 example with new wipes, the average sound level came in at 122.8 decibels, about 34.2 decibels lower than a reference pistol. That is still not movie silence. It is not a whisper. But inside a city already full of engines, boots, doors, and winter wind, cutting a gunshot by that margin changes the social physics of murder. Fewer witnesses look up. Fewer people understand what they heard. Precious seconds disappear. Those seconds were the whole business model. The strangest thing about the Welrod is how little it wants to look like a normal handgun. The magazine forms the grip. The profile is awkward, almost improvised. It looks less like a service pistol than a workshop device that somehow learned to kill. That was the point. It was not built for parade ground handling or officer prestige. It was built so an operative could carry a nearly unmarked weapon, fire a handful of rounds, and leave investigators with as little political proof as possible. Some weapons become most valuable exactly where governments need plausible deniability most. The Welrod mattered not in open war, but in the narrow gap between official policy and unofficial violence. Britain wanted such a weapon for resistance and sabotage. Once it existed, and once it moved by parachute, courier, theft, and capture, control became a fantasy. That is what makes the Copenhagen attack larger than one failed assassination. The reversal sits inside the design itself. A British clandestine pistol meant to help free occupied Europe appears in the hands of a German-backed terror squad. The same silence, the same close range, the same deniable metal. Only the target changed. The paper trail behaves like the weapon. Production began in 1943, yes. Museum and collector sources often repeat about 2,800 pistols. Other histories push the total as high as 14,000. That is not a small discrepancy. It is the kind of gap you get when secrecy is part of manufacture, when markings are sparse, when subcontracting and post-war classified use muddy every ledger. A normal service pistol leaves records because armies need them. The Welrod was born trying not to be recorded. So when people remember it now, they often remember the gadget first, the integrally suppressed barrel, the covert profile, the SOE mystique, the almost absurdly specialized mission. But in Christian Dam's study, the weapon comes into focus. Not romantic, not elegant. A 5-shot .32 made for contact range killing, crossing from resistance mythology into domestic terror in one motion of the hand. Dam survived the attack, badly wounded, and that survival leaves a strange afterimage on the whole story. The Welrod is famous as a precision instrument of quiet death. Here, in one of its most chilling real-world appearances, it does something worse for the imagination. It leaves a man alive inside the silence. Long after the men were gone, the room remained. Papers on the desk, blood on the floor. In that warm indoor light, a nearly anonymous British pistol had shown what made it forbidden was never just the suppressor. It could cross a border, lose its name, and still keep working. Quietly enough that the house around it seemed, for a few seconds more, completely still. Number 7. High Standard HDM suppressed pistol. On May 1, 1960, Soviet officials laid out the possessions taken from Francis Gary Powers after his U-2 came down near Sverdlovsk. Maps, coins, tools, poison, and one suppressed American pistol. It was only 13.815 inches long, weighed 2 pounds 15 ounces, fed from a 10-round magazine, and fired the tiny .22 long rifle cartridge. Hardly the sort of weapon you would expect to survive as Cold War evidence. But that is exactly what it became. A clandestine sidearm, designed to leave almost no acoustic trace, suddenly displayed in public as proof of American espionage. The gun was supposed to erase noise. Instead, it made a geopolitical scandal louder. And the strangest part is that by 1960, the weapon already carried 2 histories at once, one on paper, one in shadow. The paper trail begins cleanly enough. November 22, 1943. High Standard Manufacturing Company of New Haven, Connecticut receives a contract for 1,500 suppressed Model HD pistols for the OSS. Not a battle pistol, not a trench weapon, a target pistol reworked into a clandestine tool. The basic frame came from the High Standard Model HD, but the mission changed completely. This was for agents, resistance work, indoor operations, night movement, sentry removal. A weapon for the moments when a normal gunshot would ruin everything. So start with the modification, because the numbers read like forensic notes from a machine built around one obsession. 44 holes drilled into the barrel, each 1/8 of an inch wide, each spaced 1/4 inch apart. Their job was to bleed propellant gas before it could crack into open air. Around that barrel sat a 7.75-inch steel tube packed with 20 tin-plated bronze screens and another 110 screen discs. The point was not power. The point was containment. Slow the gas. Trap the blast. Turn a shot into something the OSS could describe, with barely concealed satisfaction, as quieter than traffic noise or a closing door. That claim sounds like brochure language until you see how much maintenance the silence demanded. Cleaning was recommended after 20 rounds. Replacement screen material came after 250. This was not the kind of pistol you dumped into a holster and forgot. It was a tuned instrument. Fire 10 rounds from the magazine, and you still had to think about carbon, fouling, screen wear, the gradual death of suppression inside that tube. The quiet was real, but it was expensive in attention. And that is what makes one wartime artifact so revealing. In surviving OSS records and later histories, the name itself slides around. HDMS in one primary account. HDM almost everywhere else. A tiny shift, one letter dropped, but it tells you something about the world this gun lived in. Inventory names blur, technical figures drift. Even the suppressor performance gets reported differently depending on the source. In a normal Army sidearm, that kind of ambiguity is annoying. In a clandestine one, it starts to look like the design brief. Because the record does not stop at a contract, it moves fast, and the speed tells you who wanted this thing. Deliveries began on January 20th, 1944. Within days, the pistol was being shown in Algiers. On February 1st, General Douglas MacArthur received 20 of them. 6 passed to the Alamo Scouts. Summer it was circulating through OSS field stations. William J. Donovan liked it enough to demonstrate it to Franklin Roosevelt in the Oval Office itself, which is an astonishing image if you stop and picture it. The head of the OSS showing the President of the United States a pistol whose entire purpose was to make killing sound unreal. But one report complicates the legend in a useful way. The Alamo Scouts, operating behind Japanese lines, are said to have used the pistol not just against men, but to hunt food. That detail matters because it breaks the lazy mythology. We like to remember suppressed pistols as assassination props, all trench coats and passwords. But in the jungle, silence is practical before it is cinematic. A loud shot gives away position. A patrol living behind enemy lines does not need drama. It needs meat without detection. So the same .22 that looks underpowered on paper becomes, in the right conditions, exactly the right tool. And yes, underpowered is the obvious objection. A .22 long rifle round is tiny beside the service cartridges that dominated the war. No one carried this because it hit like a .45. They carried it because that was never the point. At close distance, with careful shot placement, the gun could do what it was built to do. But the deeper logic was operational, not ballistic. If the mission depended on one guard going down without waking the next room, this strange little pistol began to make sense. That is the recurring answer hiding inside so many banned or buried weapons. The ones that worked best often solved the exact problem respectable armies did not want to describe out loud. There is another clue in the markings. SS-delivered pistols were stamped "Property of U.S." and bore ordnance marks. Later CIA examples did not. Same basic silhouette, different relationship to attribution. That difference seems minor until you think about what covert services actually need. An army wants accounting. A clandestine service wants options. If the pistol is found, whose pistol is it? If the serial trail goes cold, was that a manufacturing inconsistency? Or was deniability built into the afterlife of the weapon as carefully as silence had been built into its barrel? By the end of World War II, the U.S. government had purchased 2,620 of these suppressed high standards. That is too many to dismiss as a curiosity, but far too few to call a mainstream sidearm. They sit in that revealing middle ground where special weapons often live, not experimental, not common, but quietly indispensable to a narrow class of mission. Enough to matter, not enough to advertise. So go back to that evidence table in 1960. Soviet hands arranging American spy equipment under bright lights. The little suppressed pistol sitting there among survival gear and concealment tools. It had been born in 1943 from an OSS contract, refined for silence with 44 barrel ports and a tube full of bronze screens, carried through war by scouts and agents, and then resurfaced in the Cold War as exhibit material. The weapon meant to hide an action had become a document of it, not missing, not deniable, captured. Number 6. Nagant M1895 with Bramit suppressor. You're in a patch of forest at night. Snow crusts under your boots. A scout ahead of you freezes, lifts one hand, and points through the trees. There's a sentry maybe 20 yards out. Too close for a rifle shot you want anyone else to hear. Too exposed for a struggle. Your hand goes to a revolver designed before radio was common, before tanks ruled battlefields, before the war you're in was even imaginable. 7 rounds, a 114mm barrel, about 780 grams of steel in the hand. On the muzzle, a blunt little device turns one of the loudest handgun layouts ever made into something unnervingly quiet. It sounds backward, because it is. Most revolvers are terrible hosts for suppressors. Fire one and gas escapes sideways from the cylinder gap, right where the cylinder meets the barrel. You can muffle the muzzle all you want, the gun still spits noise out the side. So if you want a quiet pistol in World War II, you reach for an automatic. That's the normal story. The Nagant M1895 was the exception. On May 13, 1895, by decree of Nicholas II, Russia adopted a 7-shot service revolver chambered for a strange cartridge, 7.62 by 38mm R Nagant. Strange for one reason that matters here. When the trigger is pulled, the cylinder does not only rotate, it cams forward. The mouth of the cartridge case moves into the barrel throat and seals the gap ordinary revolvers leave open. A tiny mechanical trick from the 19th century. It solved the exact problem that made almost every other revolver impossible to hush. An obsolete design turned into a loophole. In the late 1920s, 2 Soviet inventors saw it. Metin brothers took that odd gas seal system and tried to turn it into a clandestine weapon. Not a parade sidearm, not a line infantry favorite. Something for work you don't put on posters. Their patent trail leads to an application in 1929, then to February 28, 1931, when a soundless revolver concept was formally described. Even the phrase soundless revolver tells you where this belongs. Not ordinary procurement, not a standard service upgrade. This is interwar Soviet experimentation in the language of secrecy. The design was stranger than just screwing a tube onto the front. The later Bramit device is usually remembered as a muzzle suppressor for the Nagant, and that is true as far as it goes. The early Metin concept also involved special ammunition and internal washers that helped trap gas. The shooter was not just handling fired cases, he also had to deal with captured parts inside the suppressor arrangement. Quiet came at the cost of convenience. That trade shows up again and again in weapons built for missions no one wants to explain in daylight. The Nagant with a Bramit was never impressive in the glamorous ways people imagine. It was not powerful. It was not fast to reload. It was not modern. The M1895 loads through a side gate, one chamber at a time, like a gun from another century. Under stress, that is miserable. If you think of it as a fighting pistol for open combat, you are already using it wrong. If your problem is one person, one dog, one guard post, one short burst of violence that must stay inside a very small circle of awareness, its weaknesses matter less than its silence. That is where the gun stayed alive. In the jobs regular doctrine preferred not to describe. By World War II, that narrow usefulness had spread. Suppressed Soviet weapons were no longer just odd workshop experiments. NKVD personnel used Bramit-type devices. Red Army reconnaissance units used them too. Not because they were ideal sidearms in general, but because they were ideal sidearms for a very specific category of task. Close, clandestine work, short range, limited shots, get in and get out. The pattern is hard to miss. The weapons that worked best were often the ones authorities tried hardest to ban or bury, because they worked best in missions states preferred not to describe. A suppressed Nagant fits that pattern almost perfectly. No battlefield prestige, just administrative denial with a trigger. There is one problem. The timeline gets slippery. Some summaries push suppressed Nagants with Bramit devices all the way back to 1931, as if the thing was already there in recognizable form. Wartime adoption and large-scale production tend to show up in documents from 1940 to 1942. That leaves a gap. Did 1931 mean the patent stage only? Small experimental batches? Limited security service issue? Or did later writers collapse several different Bramit-type devices into one convenient origin story? We know the concept was real. We know the wartime use was real. The line between invention, issue, and actual field standardization is still muddy. The numbers, at least, show this was no one-off curiosity. At Soviet factory number 536, from May through December 1942, production of Bramit suppressors reached 58,940 units. Figure covers Soviet silent weapon needs more broadly, not just one holstered Nagant on one operative's belt. It shows the idea had moved from tinkering into manufacturing. Quiet killing was being supplied at industrial scale. Industrial scale did not mean maintenance-free. Soviet wipe suppressors had a cost. Rubber elements wore out. On the Mosin Bramit, wipe life is often given at around 60 rounds, and in winter maybe only 15 to 20. Cold made things worse. Materials stiffened, performance dropped. The details vary by weapon, but the principle carries over. These were not magic tubes. They were consumable, fussy, mission-driven devices. You did not hand them out to everybody. You issued them to the people whose orders justified the hassle. The Nagant with Bramit sits in a revealing place. It is a sidearm, but barely a general one. It is a revolver, but almost the only revolver of its era that could do this trick well. It is old, and that old feature is the whole point. That is why it kept a place in the shadows long after more glamorous pistols looked like the future. Picture the contradiction. A design adopted in 1895, a 7-shot relic with a loading gate, a gun many armies would call outdated on sight. Add one suppressor, one specialized cartridge logic, one institutional appetite for quiet work, and the relic becomes the specialist. Not because it wins a contest on paper, because it answers a question most weapons cannot answer at all. You need one shot, maybe two. You need them close, you need them discreet. You need the sound to die where it stands. So no, the forbidden sidearm here was not forbidden because it was spectacular. It's forbidden because it was practical in a way that made paperwork uncomfortable. The Nagant did not break the rules by being advanced. It broke them by making secrecy mechanical. The strangest part is that the clue had been built into the gun from the beginning. The feature that made the Bramit possible was sitting there in 1895, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a different kind of war to discover what it was really for. As one wartime Soviet description put it, this was for silent, flameless shooting. Number 5. Welrod Mark I. In late 1942, Major Hugh Quentin Reeves stands under workshop lights at Station 9 near Welwyn, Hertfordshire. A paper lies on the bench in front of him. Not a battlefield report, not a patent sketch. A requirement. Give SOE agents and resistance fighters a pistol that does not behave like a pistol. It has to be carried through occupied streets. It has to come up at arm's length. It has to fire at a man 8 yards away or less. It has to leave as little trace of itself as possible. No sharp crack, no busy slide snapping backward, no shape a policeman recognizes in a coat pocket. One close shot that disappears into everything else the street is already saying. Reeves looks down at parts that barely resemble a sidearm. A plain tube, a narrow receiver, a grip that is not really a grip because the grip is the magazine and the magazine comes off. Separate them and the thing stops looking like a gun. It becomes two pieces of metal. One is 364 millimeters long. The other is small enough to vanish into a different pocket. Sterile. Awkward. Promising. By January 1943, the first concept is ready. And it is wrong in the familiar way first concepts often are. Too clumsy. Too compromised. Too much machine for a weapon that is supposed to leave almost no mechanical signature. So the bench fills with revisions. A normal self-loading pistol uses recoil to cycle the next round. That movement makes noise. Noise is the one thing this job cannot tolerate. The action is stripped back to something almost primitive, a manually operated bolt. You fire. Nothing slams to the rear. Nothing clatters forward. If another round is needed, the shooter works it by hand. Spring 1943. Prototype samples appear in April. On the bench, they still look unfinished, because they are. The little .32 version moves first. In June 1943, it is being developed as the Mark II, which sounds backward until you handle the paperwork. The numbering is not about which Welrod exists first in history. It is about which line it belongs to. The .32 comes first into production as the Mark II. The heavier 9mm will later become the Mark I. Even its name arrives through a side door. Now you are the one holding it. The room is cold. There is oil on your fingers. The tube is only 34mm across, 120 high with the magazine in place, and almost absurdly plain. No elegant contours, no display case virtues. Nothing of a gentleman's pistol about it. It feels like something assembled for a single unpleasant sentence. You seat the magazine into the grip. 6 rounds of 9mm parabellum when the final form arrives, because by now the smaller cartridge has started to disappoint the men who think in field distances and human targets rather than workshop tolerances. The .32 can be made quieter. It can carry 8 rounds. But the same complaints keep coming back. Stopping power, usefulness. What happens when the shot is perfect on paper and not perfect in the street? The weapon shifts towards certainty, not beauty. By the summer of 1943, the work crosses the Atlantic. Washington, D.C., the Washington Navy Yard, the Naval Gun Factory, July into September. An American officer opens a case and finds a British pistol that looks less like a service weapon than a plumbing component. No heroic lines to admire. That helps. When it fires, that helps even more. The official cover name in U.S. hands will be Hand Firing Device Mark I, a title so dry it almost hides itself. That is part of the design, too. A thing built for secret work tries not to be noticed, even on paper. You are in the test room now. Concrete walls, ear protection in hand, though you barely trust your eyes more than your ears. The weapon is loaded. Bolt worked. The target is close because close is the entire logic of this machine. Recommended range? 8 yards. Not 50, not 25. 8. You do not ask this pistol to negotiate distance, speed, or panic. You ask for one answer at nearly touching range. The shot comes. Not silence, never true silence. A blunt, reduced cough. A mechanism refusing to announce itself. No slide chasing itself back and forth. No ordinary pistol rhythm. Just the report, cut down, and then the room filling with the strange absence where louder noise should have been. One man behind the bench writes. Another watches the muzzle. Another watches the target. This is not a dual weapon. It is not meant for 2 armed men finding each other across a room and seeing who is faster. It is built for the moment before that. A sentry near a gate. A collaborator in a doorway. A targeted killing where one shot has to vanish into truck engines, boots on pavement, a radio through an open window. The tester breaks the gun down again. Magazine out. Separate the pieces. In the hand it becomes less legible, less accusatory. Tube in one pocket. Magazine grip in another. On a search table, if luck holds, it may not declare itself immediately. Here, that matters more than rate of fire ever could. The user may need to walk to the target looking unarmed and walk away looking ordinary. Back in Britain, the same logic is already hardening into metal. Fieldmen want a weapon that works at handshake distance and settles the matter. The larger 9mm version answers them, but it keeps the same brutal compromise under everything else about the Welrod. It gives up convenience for discretion. It gives up speed for less sound. It gives up the normal shape of a pistol so it can be carried as something less obvious than a pistol. In a war obsessed with mass production, this thing remains narrow, fussy, and specialized. Perhaps 14,000 were made. Roughly 2,800 were delivered. The uncertainty fits. Weapons like this pass through records the way they pass through pockets. Carefully, incompletely, and under names that do not want to be remembered. The case is closed. The bench is cleared. An agent receives the weapon in parts, then assembles it with practiced hands. Night Street. Damp stone. A bicycle passes. Farther off, a lorry changes gears. He waits in a recessed doorway and feels the weight of 6 rounds in the grip. Ahead, a single figure pauses beneath a lamp, half-turned, collar up against the weather. The agent brings the tube up with both hands, works the bolt once, steps forward until the distance is no longer measured in yards so much as footsteps. Then the figure starts to turn. Number 4. Luger P08 Artillery with Snail Drum. In October 1917, H.M. Chandi of the 4th Battalion Middlesex Regiment went underground east of Ypres into the Canada tunnels below Passchendaele. Down there, war shrank from landscapes to corridors. On the surface, artillery kept tearing the ridge into mud. Below it, in galleries cut through clay and chalk, a fight could happen at arm's length. A rifle was long. A bayonet was awkward. A normal sidearm gave you 8 shots, and then your hand was suddenly very busy. Somewhere in that world, the long Luger enters the record. The Imperial War Museums holds one example, Catalog FIR 2693, a Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken pistol made in Berlin in 1917, tied in the museum record to Chandi and to those Canada tunnels. This is not a vague type specimen. It is a surviving object with a name, a date, and mud in its story, whether the metal still shows it or not. Overall length, 320 millimeters. Height, 138. Weight, just over 1 kilogram unloaded. Long-barreled, narrow-waisted, all hard edges and mechanical confidence. The official rear sight is marked absurdly far, out to 800 meters. On paper, it still pretends to be useful at distances where pistol bullets are mostly negotiating with gravity. Chandi did not go into the tunnels to admire tangent sights. The weapon Germany had adopted in 1913 for light artillery troops was the Lange Pistole 08, the LP-08, what collectors would later call the artillery Luger. The original logic was straightforward. Gun crews needed something handier than a full rifle, but more substantial than a compact pistol. Standard P08 stretched into a 7 7/8-inch barrel with the option of a shoulder stock to steady it. A sidearm, but longer. A pistol, but not entirely willing to remain one. Then the trenches changed it. By 1916, the LP08 had picked up the accessory that turned it from oddity into problem. The Trommelmagazin 08, the snail drum. 32 rounds instead of 8. Add the stock, and the long Luger stopped behaving like a gentleman's sidearm. It became a compact assault weapon for storm troops, trench raiders, men expecting a fight to begin through a doorway or at the bend of a sap. It still fired pistol ammunition. It was not a true submachine gun. The MP-18 would soon make that brutally clear. But before that standardization arrived, the stocked LP-08 with drum was one of the few formal military attempts to bridge the gap between handgun and shoulder arm with a semi-automatic pistol caliber package. If you are Chandi, or one of the men facing it in a tunnel, that distinction matters less than the arithmetic. 8 rounds means count. 32 rounds means survive the first confusion and keep firing through the second. Picture the space. You are below the ridge. The roof is low enough that posture becomes a tactical decision. The walls sweat. The floor is slick. Sound behaves badly down there. It snaps, bounces, and lies about distance. In that environment, a rifle can catch on a support timber. A stocked pistol with a drum can swing inside the space available. Not elegantly, not comfortably, but enough. Enough is what matters. This relic sits awkwardly in the story of forbidden sidearms. It was not created as a gangster curiosity or an exotic special operations toy. It was a practical answer to a specific battlefield problem. Around 180,000 artillery Lugers were made during the First World War by DWM and Erfurt. Not rare in their own moment, not fringe. Germany invested in them because, for a brief window before true submachine guns took over, they worked. Then peace made them look dangerous. Weapons that work in one kind of war often become politically alarming afterward. After 1918, the Versailles restrictions did not punish Germany only in the abstract. They targeted categories of arms that seemed to invite the next war. The stocked, long Luger fell into that poisoned space, too martial, too adaptable, too closely associated with assault troops and sudden close violence. A pistol with a detachable stock and a 32-round drum does not read like a defensive sidearm. It reads like a loophole wearing a holster. By the time Europe is heading back toward war, the LP08 is already a ghost. The standard P08 itself is aging out. It is expensive to machine and fussy by comparison with what modern mass war wants. During World War II, it is being replaced by the cheaper Walther P38. Mauser keeps Luger production going into the war, but stops in 1942 as the P38 takes over. On inventory sheets, the future belongs elsewhere. Inventory sheets are one thing, battlefields are another. Old LP08s survived, drums survived, stocks survived. Police stores held on to things, veterans kept trophies. Captured weapons crossed borders in kit bags. That is the murky edge this pistol lives on during the Second World War. Was it a standard German sidearm then? No. Was it gone? Also no. Lingered where forbidden weapons often linger. In leftovers, in private carry, in odd depots, in the space between issued and merely available. For Chandi, the story begins with one specimen in 1917. For the object itself, the meaning keeps changing. First, it is a practical tool for artillerymen. Then, trench warfare mutates it into a raider's weapon. Then, Versailles turns it toxic. Then a new war arrives, and the old toxic thing has not disappeared after all. It has slipped out of the clean categories. The long Luger with the snail drum exposes the pattern running through all of this. The weapon was not buried because it failed. It was pushed aside because it succeeded too specifically. In a muddy tunnel, in a trench traverse, in a room where range collapses to steps, it solved a problem too well for polite definitions to contain it. The official story says it was obsolete by World War II. The object says something harsher. Museums kept it, depots kept it, pockets kept it. Someone had found it useful enough not to let it disappear. Number 3. Browning high power with shoulder stock. In April 1943, a Chinese request landed in Toronto with the kind of numbers that make procurement officers sit up straight. 180,000 Browning high-power pistols. Not ordinary pistols. Each one chambered in 9mm, fed from a 13-round magazine, fitted with a tangent rear sight marked from 50 to 500 meters, and cut at the grip so a wooden holster could lock on as a shoulder stock. A sidearm was being pushed into the space between pistol and carbine. The sensational version writes itself. China wanted a secret super pistol, Canada built it, and the Allies quietly produced one of the strangest sidearms of the war. Start with the hardware. The hardware explains the request. The Browning high power already held more rounds than most military pistols of its day. 13 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber if loaded that way, in a package still compact enough for a belt holster. Then came the tangent sight and the slot at the backstrap. The wooden case stopped being just a case. It became a shoulder stock. The sight radius stayed short, the barrel stayed pistol length, but that third point of contact made the gun steadier, especially in rapid fire. For an officer, driver, radio operator, artilleryman, or vehicle crewman, that meant more control than a normal pistol without the burden of a full rifle. It sounds extravagant now. In 1943, it was familiar logic in newer metal. China had liked stocked pistols long before the high power existed. The Mauser C96 had already shown a whole generation what a stocked handgun could do in the space between sidearm and carbine. So when China asked Canada for high powers with shoulder stock holsters through the Mutual Aid Plan, this was not a feverish wartime gimmick. It was a specific request from a country that already understood the type. The myth says a design office invented a bizarre hybrid. The evidence says the customer knew exactly what he wanted. Then came the production problem. In 1943, the high power was a Belgian design, and Belgium was under German occupation. FN's factory was under enemy control. John Inglis and Company in Toronto was being asked to manufacture the pistol at scale without access to the original production line. British channels supplied drawings. FN-linked engineers Dieudonné Saive and René Laloux were brought into the effort. English engineers also studied 6 pre-war Chinese contract pistols. Some accounts lean more heavily on the drawings. Others put more weight on reverse engineering those 6 guns. The exact balance is still muddy. What matters is simpler. The pistol was not improvised. It was rebuilt from paper, expertise, and surviving examples because its industrial home was behind German lines. By January 1944, the Chinese pattern prototypes were being tested. By February, production had begun. The result became known as the English No. 1. Strip away the legend and the specification is almost painfully practical. A 9mm service pistol, a tangent sight for optimistic long-range aiming, a slotted grip to accept a detachable stock, a wooden holster built to double as that stock. Small Arms Limited was contracted for 140,000 holster stocks and another 40,000 canvas holsters. Even the accessories show the same split personality. It was meant to be both sidearm and kit system, belt weapon and emergency shoulder arm. Compact, but not simple. This is where the myth usually swerves off the road. People see the stock, hear 500 meters on the rear sight, and picture a pocket rifle. It was not that. A tangent sight can be marked to 500 meters. That does not mean a pistol with a short barrel becomes a true 500-meter weapon. Those numbers belong partly to doctrine and partly to hope. The stock helped. It made the gun steadier, faster to recover, easier to control. But it did not suspend ballistics. It did not turn a handgun into a submachine gun or a carbine. The men ordering it were buying a compromise, and they knew it. So why does it still feel like a forbidden weapon? Partly because stocked pistols always drift toward legal trouble. Put a shoulder stock on an ordinary pistol in modern American law, and you are suddenly flirting with short-barreled rifle treatment. The category still feels unnatural. Too big for a pistol, too small for a rifle, unusually useful in the narrow band where both overlap. But the original English No. 1 Chinese contract guns, with the correct Canadian holster stock, are specifically recognized by the ATF as curio and relic exceptions. Even the paperwork has to admit this weapon sits in a strange historical box. The biggest surprise came later, and it had nothing to do with the design. It had to do with movement. The first 4,000 pistols made it as far as Karachi in India. Then they stopped. Crates reached the docks. Paperwork said China. The route ahead ran over the Himalayas, and cargo space was a fight. The pistols were not rejected. They did not break. Stock idea had not collapsed into fantasy. They stalled because higher priority materiel took the space. Fuel, medicine, radios, truck parts. Logistics is merciless that way. A weapon can work exactly as intended and still lose to tonnage tables. By the fall of 1944, under Allied logistics pressure and with General Joseph Stilwell favoring more easily supplied arms, the contract was suspended. Only those initial 4,000 had gone forward toward China, and even they had stuck in the pipeline. Another 14,487 Chinese pattern pistols had already been produced and were waiting for shipment when the order died in place. Not canceled in a blaze of scandal, not denounced as a bad idea, just stranded by the arithmetic of war. The sensational claim collapses once the paper trail shows up. This was not a magical wonder weapon buried because it frightened generals. It was a smart answer to a specific Chinese requirement, built in Canada after an occupied Belgian design had to be reconstructed from fragments. It was meant to give men who could not conveniently carry a rifle more stability and more reach than a normal sidearm. By every sign we have, it likely would have done exactly that. War tests supply chains as hard as it tests weapons. Many of the Chinese stocked pistols never reached China at all. They were absorbed instead by Canadian and British users and by the SOE, where a compact handgun that could wear a stock made its own kind of sense. So the object survived with two identities, one as a contract pistol for a customer it largely never served, another as a wartime British Commonwealth sidearm born from that failed journey. English high-power production would eventually reach 153,480 pistols. The Chinese stocked version was only one branch of that story. But it shows the pattern clearly. Useful weapons were not always banned. Sometimes they simply did not fit neat categories. Sometimes they did not fit neat supply either. Picture the end of the line. A row of finished #1 pistols in a Canadian factory. Slotted grips cut, tangent sights in place, wooden stocks stacked beside them in crates, 13 rounds ready, 500 meters stamped on steel. China painted on the paperwork, and no battlefield waiting at the other end. A useful weapon went into the system for one war and came out assigned to another. Number 2. Mauser M712 Schnellfeuer. In 1945, Allied troops searching German depots kept finding a pistol that made no numerical sense. It fit in a holster. It fired the standard 7.63 by 25mm Mauser cartridge, but it took a detachable 20-round magazine and, on full auto, ran at roughly 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute. The contradiction shows up fast. At 900 rounds per minute, 15 rounds leave the gun in a single second. A full 20-round magazine is gone in just over one. A sidearm is supposed to buy time. This one spent it. The trail starts earlier, and the numbers get stranger the farther back you go. In 1932, at Mauser's factory in Oberndorf, engineer Karl Westinge took the old C96 pattern and pushed it past a line it had been nearing for years. The silhouette stayed familiar. Long barrel, magazine ahead of the trigger, broom handle grip. Inside, it changed. The fixed magazine was out. The detachable box magazine was in. Semi-auto only was out. A selector for automatic fire was in. The result was the Model 1932 Schnellfeuer, later labeled M712 by the Wehrmacht. Production began in 1932 and is commonly placed ending in 1936. Total output is usually given at about 98,000, though some counts push it to just over 100,000. That uncertainty says something by itself. The gun moved through reputation faster than through paperwork. Start with the cartridge. 7.63 by 25mm Mauser. Fast, narrow, already tied to the C96 family in the minds of buyers from Europe to China. That mattered. Mauser was not creating demand from nothing. By the time Westinger's gun appeared, Chinese buyers already knew the shape, the caliber, and the roll. Spanish firms had been sending full-auto C96-style pistols into that market before Mauser's official answer arrived. The German factory was not unveiling a novelty. It was entering a race late, and it had to answer with numbers. Those numbers were practical before they were dramatic. 10-round magazine, 20-round magazine, shoulder stock, selector. A pistol carried like a sidearm, then used like a short carbine, in a city street, a stairwell, or inside a building. That awkward middle ground was the whole point. In theory, rifles were one category and handguns another. In practice, China, after the 1919 arms embargo agreement, created a market shaped by loopholes. Rifles were harder to move and easier to restrict. A stocked pistol could slip through the gap. Call it a handgun on paper, and the weapon changed character the moment the wood stock locked on. The M712 was not forbidden because one rule happened to catch it. It was forbidden because it made the categories stop meaning what they said. Look at the firing rate again. Roughly 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute. On a full-size submachine gun, that is already fast. On a pistol-sized frame, it is close to absurd. At 1,000 rounds per minute, one round leaves the muzzle every 0.06 seconds. A 10-round magazine lasts about 0.6 seconds. A 20-round magazine lasts about 1.2. Picture the sequence. You draw, you press. Before your brain has fully processed the first burst, the magazine is nearly empty. Period accounts and later demonstrations keep landing in the same place. Without the shoulder stock, full auto was not elegant firepower. It was recoil management by force of personality. Myth came later. Chinese soldiers firing these things sideways to sweep a room. The image stuck because the exaggeration still contains a piece of mechanics. If the gun climbs violently and empties itself almost at once, a shooter may try to turn that climb into movement. But that is a workaround, not a doctrine. Attach the stock and the arithmetic changes. The shoulder contact adds stability. The long sight plane of the C96 pattern starts to matter more. The pistol drops the pretense. What you are really holding is a compact automatic carbine hiding in a holster. The M712 sits right on the fault line running through this whole story. Why were the weapons that worked best so often the ones they tried hardest to ban or bury? Sometimes because worked best did not mean fit best. Armies like columns on forms: pistol, rifle, submachine gun. The Schnellfeuer crossed all three and behaved badly inside each. It was too large and too fast for an ordinary sidearm. Too unstable to replace a real shoulder arm. Too specialized to standardize widely. So even where it served in small numbers. German forces had some. SS units had some. It never became the standard German pistol because standard weapons are usually the ones that ask the fewest awkward questions. The battlefield that explains it best was not Berlin. It was Shanghai. By 1937, the city had become a laboratory for close-range urban combat. Alleys, docks, warehouses, sandbagged intersections, rooms separated by one wall and a few steps. In that environment, long rifles could be clumsy. An ordinary pistol lacked range, magazine capacity, and stability. C96 type pistols, stocked pistols, and pistol carbines kept appearing with Chinese troops. The M712 belonged exactly there, in that narrow band between what doctrine wanted and what streets demanded. 20 rounds, 1 shoulder stock, 1 second of automatic fire. Enough to cross a doorway, enough to dominate a landing, enough to solve a problem before paperwork had a name for it. Even the production totals tell the same story. About 98,000, or a little over 100,000. Not millions, not a flood of standard issue. Just enough to leave tracks in China, in Europe, and later in collections where the name M712 would be used loosely enough to blur factory history with copies and cousins. The blurred count is not a side issue, it is evidence. The weapon lived in a zone where official designations, export channels, and battlefield use did not line up neatly. A pistol that acted like a submachine gun was always going to be catalogued imperfectly, because it was conceived imperfectly in the first place. Years later, when soldiers and armorers encountered one, the numbers hit first. 1932, 7.63 times 25. 10 rounds or 20. 900 to 1,000 per minute. Roughly 100,000 made. None of those figures sound impossible alone. Put them together, and they describe a category error in steel. Not a sidearm with extra capacity, not a carbine cut down. A holstered automatic weapon built for the administrative blind spot between them. The central fact of the M712 is simple. It was not hidden because it failed. It was sidelined because it worked in the wrong shape. A 20-round magazine, about 1 second. Number 1. Walther Sturmpistole. On September 12, 1943, German paratroopers came down onto the Gran Sasso Plateau to free Benito Mussolini. The landing zone sat more than 7,000 feet above sea level. The hotel clung to a mountain shelf. The approach was chaos. Gliders skidded over rock, men spilled out into thin air, guards were caught at close range. Now hold on one grounded possibility inside that scene. A sentry appears at a second-floor window. A machine pistol burst from below cannot quite reach the angle. A rifle is too long for the stairwell. One man has a break-action signal pistol in a holster and a grenade cartridge in his pouch. He snaps it open, loads, raises, fires. In one shot, a sidearm becomes a miniature launcher. It sounds like field improvisation. It was. But by late in the war, the Germans pushed further and tried to formalize it. They built a pistol meant to throw explosives from the hip. The first number that matters is not caliber, it is range. A normal pistol fight happens across a room, a hallway, maybe a street. The Walther Sturmpistole pushed that envelope out toward grenade distance. Depending on the load and on the man trying to sight it in, you were no longer talking about 10 yards or 20. You were talking about 50 meters, 75, sometimes 100 for signaling, harassment, or anti-personnel effects. That was the leap. A holster weapon crossing into mortar logic. As soon as a sidearm starts doing that, the neat categories collapse. The base weapon was already familiar. Germany issued the Leuchtpistole, a 26.5mm flare pistol for signals, illumination, and emergency communication. Single shot, break action, short barrel. It was usually treated as a utility arm, not a fighting one. Then, war bent it in another direction. Troops in Poland, France, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union found that if you could launch a flare, you could launch other things too. Smoke, signal stars, improvised projectiles, eventually dedicated explosive rounds. The problem was precision. The original pistols were not built for offensive fire. They kicked hard. They lacked proper sights. They punished the shooter if he tried to use them like handguns instead of signaling tools. So Walther and others refined the idea. The Sturmpistole was essentially the combat evolution of that family, a reinforced flare pistol fitted for grenade launching duty, often with a folding stock and a leaf sight to give the shooter at least some chance of putting the round where he wanted it. It was not elegant. It was not comfortable. But now the man carrying dispatch and illumination gear could also carry a close support weapon. That created its own mess. The German army did not need another pistol. It needed cheap, explosive projection at squad level. Rifle grenades already existed, but they added weight and complication. Dedicated launchers existed too, but not always in the right numbers or in the right places. Submachine guns solved one kind of close-range violence. They did nothing for a dugout, a window, a reverse slope, or a room behind cover. The Sturmpistole sat in that gap. One man, one holster-sized frame, one explosive round lobbed into a place bullets could not easily solve. Picture the Eastern Front in 1942. Snow packed into trench lips. Visibility broken by timber huts and earthworks. You are 20 meters from a position. Close for artillery. Too exposed for a clean rifle shot. Too late for anyone to hand you a specialist weapon. That is where these ugly hybrids start to make sense. A soldier cracks open the breech, seats a grenade cartridge the width of a shotgun shell on bad intentions, closes it, braces the stock, and fires at an embrasure. It is not a Panzerfaust. It is not a mortar. In that moment, it borrows enough from both to matter. It mattered for another reason. It blurred the line between signal equipment and prohibited firepower. The Hague system had long tried to regulate certain classes of explosive use, especially when fired from small arms at personnel. In practice, the legal details got muddy, as wartime law usually does. The instinct behind the discomfort was simple. A pistol is one thing. A pocket grenade launcher is another. The Sturmpistole kept edging toward that second category. Not with the clean honesty of a dedicated launcher, but with the deniability of a signal pistol that happened to throw high explosive. That deniability had limits. German manuals treated these weapons seriously enough to issue sights, stocks, and special ammunition. Some versions could fire anti-personnel rounds like the Sprenggranatpatrone, turning a line of communication tool into something closer to a very short, very crude one-man grenade launcher. Others could launch shaped charge projectiles in anti-armor roles, though practical effectiveness depended heavily on range, angle, luck, and nerve. Against light vehicles or the vulnerable side of armor, even that possibility changed behavior. A sidearm was not supposed to make a crew button up. This one could. Never became a glamorous wonder weapon. The drawbacks were obvious the second you handled it. It was single shot, slow to reload, heavy for a pistol, and too awkward for sustained combat. Recoil was brutal. Accuracy was never friendly. Ammunition types could confuse already stressed troops. The barrel still hinged like a signaling tool because that is what it remained underneath. So the Sturmpistole lived in the place forbidden sidearms usually do. Not standard enough to define the war, but useful enough to survive every objection raised against it. That is why it belongs at the top of this list. Pen guns, sleeve guns, Suppressed pistols, stocked automatics, and machine pistols all stretched the meaning of a sidearm. This one broke it. A sidearm usually puts a bullet into a body. The Sturmpistole put an explosive charge into a space. A doorway, a trench bay, a room corner, a vehicle slit. It did not pause over whether a pistol should do that. It answered the need in front of the man holding it. On enough battlefields, that was enough. Go back to that cold possibility on Gran Sasso, or to a cellar in Stalingrad, or to a hedgerow lane in Normandy. The weapon in a holster is no longer a last-ditch defensive arm. It is the fastest available way to deliver a grenade exactly where doctrine did not plan for one. The whole category shifts. You are not looking at a backup weapon anymore. You are looking at improvised close support disguised as a sidearm. Weapons like this keep resurfacing whenever armies run short on time, space, or permission. Once a flare pistol becomes a grenade launcher, the paperwork is already losing. Last clue is in how soldiers described these things when theory gave way to use. Not as elegant arms, not as precision tools, as practical answers. In German manuals and recollections, the language stays blunt, almost embarrassed by how direct the idea is. A pistol for assault work. A signal gun adapted for combat. A stopgap that kept getting used because stopgaps that fail disappear. This one did not. It stayed in inventories, manuals, and memory because it solved problems in the wrong shape. As one period term put it simply, for firing explosive projectiles.